first of all, I'd like to thank the American Farriers Journal and, of course, Jeremy McGovern for having me here tonight to present this webinar on mistakes to avoid when using hoof boots. First of all, for those of you that don't know me, I've been a farrier for over 12 years, and for 10 of those years, I've worked extensively with composite materials, hoof boots, composite shoes, glue work. I do a lot of therapeutic rehabilitation work, as well as performance booting and composite shoeing. I also have a number of leadership roles in our industry that I'm quite proud of, including being the Vice President of the Equine Lameness Prevention Organization and in the committee chairperson for AAPF for the PR committee. And I've been a speaker and teacher since 2009, presenting at conventions and different universities, and certainly abroad. I've been to Africa and Australia and Europe. And so I've had a lot of amazing opportunities through sharing things about composite materials. But really, at the end of the day, tonight, our presentation, focusing on hoof boots, is that we are all going to have clients that approach us at some point about wanting to keep their horse barefoot and utilizing barefoot with boots as their performance tool or even as a therapy tool at some point in your career. And they can really be a valuable asset to you in your business, but also can have a steep learning curve if you're not familiar with their ins and outs. So hopefully our talk tonight will help you a little bit with some of those things. But really, hoof boots are a good choice for many horses in many disciplines, and in performance, endurance and trail riding seems to be an obvious choice for hoof boots, but also disciplines like carriage driving, use of hoof boots in parades, and even appropriate hoof protection and support for horses in competitive dressage and jumping, to a degree, is quite successful. And certainly hoof boots are good for therapeutic purposes in rehabilitation as well, with many options with pads and different styles of boots for a therapeutic purpose. And certainly one of the key thoughts that I'd like to help you with tonight in terms of avoiding mistakes with your booting is that there are very few boots that really can do both therapeutic use and performance booting. Those two types of boots are very different, and I would recommend that you avoid using performance boots for therapeutic purpose or therapeutic boots for performance purpose. They have very specific criteria for success. So be very clear with the intended purpose of the boot that you're choosing and recommending to your client. And really, there are so many models and styles that it's sometimes hard to navigate which boots you should offer to your client or suggest to your client. And if you're not familiar with booting, there are great bits of information that are available through the manufacturers, from articles and blogs, from things like fit kits, size charts. Return policies and exchange policies can also be quite flexible when you're learning. And until you figure out what boots work for you, in particular for your business and for your clients and the type of horses that you work with, it's a good idea to get familiar with all the different recommendations from the manufacturer, because they have a vested interest in your success with recommending their product, and they're available to support you. And being educated yourself about the boot modifications that are available, not only the boots themselves, but also what you can do to them, can greatly expand your ability to help different horses with different boot challenges and help your booting be more successful, whether it's therapeutic or performance in nature. Some of the boot modifications that you might want to have in your toolbox would be things like heat fitting or grinding mechanics into the sole surface of the boot. Those things can be quite helpful. Things like adding strapping or other accessories that some of the manufacturers offer, like studding for traction, or even using tape in certain situations to help with boot fit and adhesion. But really, at the end of the day, when it comes to boot fit, the best boot for the horse is the one that fits the horse in front of you, fits the horse's foot specifically in front of you, that it's suitable for the horse's job, and also that the owner doesn't mind applying. So when you walk up to your client, you decided you want to offer hoof boots to your client, and there's so many boots out there available, it really helps to make a thorough investigation before you recommend a specific boot. Because the more information you have at your fingertips about what the owner is looking for, what the owner can tolerate, about the shape of the horse's foot. I often get called in to do a boot fitting on a horse that isn't necessarily my client even. And so asking a lot of questions is really important about what the owner is really looking for. So if we take just that first criteria, that the boot fits the horse's foot, really each different boot has its own criteria for a quote-unquote good fit, or a fit that's going to suit for the performance that the horse might want out of the boot. So follow the recommendations of the manufacturer for fit. That's the first thing I can recommend in getting your fit successful. The manufacturer has successfully tested their product for the intended purpose, and they want to set you and the horse owner up for success. So referring back to that before you start getting creative with your recommendations is certainly important. And yet there's a big difference between therapeutic booting and performance booting, because therapeutic booting in its nature has to be more generous for allowing for hoof distortions due to pathology and limitations over time due to rehabilitative process. So those types of boots are kind of in a different classification where they're meant to fit very generously, they're meant to create mechanics, they're meant to create different support options with pads and things like that. Whereas your performance booting is in a different category. When you're looking at the fit and the suitability of a certain type and style of boot to fit the foot in front of you and the horse's job and all those other criteria, that keep in mind that boots are designed for a tidy foot with minimal distortions and flares when you come to the performance. Certainly therapeutic use is different. The therapeutic boot allows for some distortions and allows for that rehabilitative process. But performance booting is not that way. And of course, the trim impacts the boot fit tremendously. So there are certain foot styles that it's important to be aware can lead to booting challenges, like long toes and underrun heels and high heels can especially be challenging. So to avoid making some mistakes with your boot recommendations, it's important to pay attention to the distortions in the foot in front of you and be proactive in addressing those distortions for the best boot fit and then performance in your performance horses. If you don't think that you have a healthy barefoot in front of you, then to me it would be important to ask yourself, do I need a therapeutic boot in this situation, or a transitional boot, which is something we'll talk about in a little bit, or is it something that maybe I need to address my trim style in order to help with using boots in this case to help the owner. So for me, I look at it on a scale of suitability for the horse's job. It's one thing to fit the horse's foot, but you can pick a boot that fits the horse's foot, but yet isn't suitable for the horse's job, and that's not necessarily going to be a good recommendation. So thinking about performance versus therapeutic use is the first question I would ask myself. And if I'm in a performance mode, I'd be thinking about the discipline in terms of maybe what is that horse schooling, what footing is it going to be on, what discipline is it competing in, is it going to be covering distance, and of course if it's covering distance, at what speed. For example, a trail horse is not necessarily going to need the same type of boot as an endurance horse, let alone a carriage driving horse or even a schooling dressage horse, let alone what's legal for the specific discipline. Those are considerations as well. So suitability for the horse's job is certainly critical to success in recommending a boot and boot selection. And the third criteria is one that seems a little bit unusual in that the owner doesn't mind applying the boot. But you can recommend a really well-fitting boot, but if it has a complicated buckle that the owner can't physically manage, or if the boot fit has to be very snug, and therefore the owner needs to use a mallet or something to apply the boot, and they're not willing to do that, it doesn't matter if you feel that's the best boot for the horse and that foot and the horse's job. If the owner isn't willing to tolerate applying it, it's not going to be successful. So make sure you do a thorough interview of the horse's preferences for application style before you recommend a specific boot, because it helps you avoid recommending something that the owner just won't use. So now that you've figured out how to recommend a boot, you've gone ahead and thought about the shape of the horse's foot, and you've thought about the horse's job, and you've thought about what the owner might be willing to apply. How do you get the boot to the owner? And there's a lot of different choices with that. So first of all, it's easy just to make a recommendation of a specific boot and help them choose a specific size. And then the owner goes ahead and orders it. So that kind of keeps you out of the ordering process and the delivery process and things like that. And that, I certainly use it many times with certain clients, depending on the situation. You can also choose to drop ship the boot to them directly, and that means that you're going to facilitate the order. You might make a recommendation based on sizing or fitting or any of those criteria, and then call the manufacturer and ask them to ship the owner the boots that you've selected based on those criteria to suit the horse's job. And that's kind of nice because then you don't have to carry the inventory, but you can be involved in facilitating the process, and owners typically appreciate that. Of course, the third option in getting the boots to the horse are carrying the inventory yourself. And that has certain advantages. Of course, you have to have the space for it, but you do then have an opportunity to make a profit, which can be nice. And you have the benefit also of immediate application, which in certain situations, especially therapeutic purpose, can be really important. So in that respect, I personally like to carry my own inventory because I have room for it, and I deal with a lot of therapeutic cases, and therefore I can put the boot on the horse when I'm standing there. If I do a rehabilitative trim, or if I'm pulling a horse out of shoes and I want to help the owner transition the horse barefoot, I have a boot in my truck that I can supply to the owner immediately, which is greatly beneficial to my horse, the owner, and my business because the owner's happy. So think about carrying inventory as a way to provide that horse with immediate protection and to facilitate this process for the owner. So if you're going to maintain inventory, it's easy to sell the boots that you have right in your truck because you can take the boot out and you can put it on the horse and you can play with sizing, you can play with modifications. If you drop ship a boot as another alternative, or you decide to give the owner the sizing and let them order it themselves, part of the dilemma is that you're not necessarily there to bridge the gap in actually putting the boot on the horse and making sure the fit is as good as you suggested to the owner, and that it's going to do the job that you're expecting it to do. And feet are different. So sometimes you can measure a foot and what actually fits the horse is slightly different. And some of the boot manufacturers also have fit kits, which are nice, and they can help because they're basically a simplified version of the boot. You can apply it to the horse's foot and gets you closer to knowing that the size recommendation you're making is going to be successful. But to me, I decided that I wanted to carry the inventory in my truck. And so on the left here, you have a photo of, honestly, my simple inventory. I drive a truck with an 8-foot bed so that I can accommodate some bins that have different kinds of boots in them. And really what I try to do is carry the least amount of variety of boots that I am very familiar with. So narrowing down the boots that I want to carry in inventory, but boots that I'm very familiar with and I can fit well and recommend confidently to the client. And then I carry them in the most common sizes. And of course, there are going to be outliers to that, but it's helpful to be able to say to the owner, hey, I have that size in stock, or if you have an outlying situation, you can order the boot quickly and easily, no problem. My overstock, the picture on the right, is boots that we want to have on hand, but we don't necessarily need to carry in the truck, and we can have available if we need to get them to an owner, if we know we're going to a certain type of foot, what have you. And so I carry in my inventory these types of boots here. That boot I mentioned earlier about very few boots are able to bridge the gap between therapy and performance is the Easy Boot Trail, is what I personally carry for horses that are transitioning. It's something that has a generous enough fit that I can allow some distortion in my trim if I need to at that time, but yet put a pad in, a thick pad. It accommodates a slightly distorted foot. It's yet when the foot's not distorted, it suits well for light performance duty in terms of trail riding or schooling in a ring or things like that. But it does have a generous fit. So thinking about what mechanics that boot is adding in terms of your breakover and the size of the foot and how clunky is it or how heavy is it, those are all considerations that are important to keep in mind, which is why I made the recommendation earlier that having different performance versus therapeutic boots to me is very important and not really crossing them over. I forewarn my clients often about that the boot that I put them in today may not be the boot they want when the horse's feet are strong and healthy and they're doing the performance job that they'd like to do. And preparing them for the fact that they might have to have different types of boots on hand depending on what they're doing. From there, from the trail, if I'm doing therapeutic use, for me, I like to go to Easy Boot Cloud. We also use soft ride boots as well. Those are therapeutic boots that are very generous in fit and have different types of significant padding for the comfort of the horse therapeutically, but it's not a performance boot at all. And then on the other side, going to performance, if the owner, say, has some arthritis in their hands or is impatient with boot application, you might consider something like the backcountry because it's a little more conforming to the foot and yet is easy to apply. And of course, then they get more technical, like the glove is more technical and is meant for high performance, but can be used for trail riders too, as long as they don't mind applying that style of boot. Each of these boots has a different fit criteria, so keep that clear in your mind. And there are lots of other options besides these boots. This is just what I tend to go to keep my inventory specific and yet carry the most common sizes and yet not have to carry 18 different types of boots at the same time. And really at the end of the day, it's important that we keep in mind if we're going to carry boots, we have to invest money into our inventory, we need to take time to do the fitting, and we need to support the owner with our purchase. So we need to make money doing these things, or maybe we don't want to carry boots and we just want to be out trimming and shoeing horses. So for me as a business model, I charge for boot fitting. So if the owner doesn't want to pay for my time to do boot fitting and selection and application, then I can give them a recommendation on a specific boot for them to go investigate, or I can support them to varying degrees through that process. But ideally, I'd like to move my inventory. So I competitively price my inventory, and while I make a little bit of money on my inventory, what I really need is charging for my time in boot fitting. And I would encourage you to consider doing the same thing. So if you're going to carry boots or get involved in being knowledgeable about boots and then recommending it to your clients, I encourage you to charge for your time as it's appropriate for your level of experience and knowledge. Because certainly if you're just getting started, you might not charge that client because you're not sure if you're going to make an accurate recommendation. But as you get experience and you're knowledgeable, certainly you should be compensated for giving the benefit of that to your client and helping them be successful. And if they choose that they want to go do that on their own, save the money, well, that's okay. But if you're going to spend your time, I believe you should be compensated for that because you invested time and energy into those things. And so in my business, I get compensated for boot fitting, and that's an active part of my business practice and justifies my carrying the inventory. And really, at the end of the day, certainly our job as the farrier for the horse is to set the owner up for success for whatever they want to do with their horse. And a lot of that involves owner education. So talking to them, doing a thorough interview, and then being knowledgeable about the products, even if it's something that you don't use every day. If the owner just comes to you and says, I have a question about XYZ, that's something that you should be able to input on, yet necessarily be charging for your time so that you can take the time with that client to answer their questions and provide information, even if it's about hoof boots, regardless. And for me, I found that my best success with hoof boots is by using them myself and figuring out the nuances of success for my horses and riding out and doing things with my horse, so that then when I talk to clients, I can say, well, I've experimented with these things, or I've experienced these things, or I use these boots on my horses this way, especially when it comes to performance. Therapeutic use, I think you have more leeway with using boots as a transition tool before shoeing or before transitioning the horse back to barefoot. And there's more wiggle room with the expectation on the owner's part of what that boot is going to do for their client, for their animal, for your client, the animal. But for the performance horses especially, it's important that you can really give them some firsthand knowledge and be confident in your recommendation. And sometimes that takes using them yourself in order to get there. So I encourage you to try that to help you with your clients as well if you're not familiar with hoof boots. So really, sizing and fit is key. Keep in mind that performance hoof boots are made for a compact foot, and that therapeutic boots are more generous in their size and fit and allow for more variability in the foot itself and for maybe more protection or pain management as opposed to high performance. Sometimes keeping in mind that a shorter trim interval will help you keep your boots fitting really well through that cycle. And really the ideal time to fit boots on a performance horse might be in the middle of the cycle because the foot's going to change throughout the cycle. Some owners are perfectly happy having multiple boots as the foot grows or when you come to trim. And some owners really just want a boot that's going to fit throughout the whole trim cycle. That's also something that would affect my boot selection and recommendations to the client. So in terms of avoiding some mistakes in sizing and fit, if you can keep your boot choices that you offer to your clients down to a few brands and models, that will help you be an expert in their application. And also, if you choose to carry inventory, you won't have to choose so many sizes and brands to carry in your own vehicle to provide to the client. Certainly, sometimes it's hard to know where you can get more information, and there's a lot of fitting and troubleshooting resources available to you. You can do internet searches. There's lots of how-to videos and blogs. There's many manufacturer websites that have directions or information. A lot of blogs and videos are hosted on manufacturer websites, so look into that. Certainly contact the manufacturer directly. If you're not familiar with a boot and you want to recommend it to your clients, go to the manufacturer and call them and say, I want to recommend this boot. I've heard good things about it, or I'm curious about its application for these types of horses. Can you help me understand if I'm accurate in my thinking, and how would I go about being successful? Because again, they have that vested interest in you being successful with their product, so they're one of your biggest resources. You can certainly work with other farriers who do a lot of booting and get good tips and tricks. Everyone's going to have different things that work for them. So the more of that you can study and absorb and work into your toolbox, it's like any application, different barefoot trim styles, different metal shoe applications, different composite shoe applications, certainly with booting. It's part of a niche that you're going to offer potentially to your client. So approach it the same way. Talk to other farriers who do booting. Call the manufacturers, do some research, watch some videos, use the boots yourself. And if all else fails, certainly attend a clinic or a workshop. That can help you also with success with your booting. Different people out there in our industry, and the manufacturer may know who does booting workshops for their product if you're interested in a certain product. But go out there and attend a clinic on booting. You know, just like you might attend a trim workshop or a shoeing workshop or a forging day to increase your skills and your knowledge. Those sorts of things are available for booting as well. So really, in conclusion, offering hoof boots can certainly be a valuable asset to your clients. Whether it's their process that they want to keep their horse barefoot, you support them in their desire to keep their horse barefoot, whether it's a financial concern, whether it's just their preference, whether you really believe that the horse can do 90% of its life barefoot and then maybe only needs the boot for performance or for other physical activities. It's something that's a valuable tool to you in your farrier business. So I encourage you to pursue it. And it definitely can be profitable. You know, I carry a huge selection of boots in my truck. I get calls for clients who want boot fittings quite frequently because they know that's a tool that I offer in my practice, and I have the boots in my truck and they feel comfortable with that and they find value in that. And of course, regardless of a steep learning curve with the booting process, there's also a lot of support material out there, so dive in. But at the end of the day, the biggest tip to avoid mistakes is that if you're not sure if the boot's going to do the job that you're being asked for the horse in front of you, don't recommend it until you're sure it's really going to do what the owner wants and what the horse needs, whether that's therapeutic or performance.
Okay, very good. Let's go ahead. We got a few questions already for you, Daisy, and we'll start with this one. This person was unaware that you can use boots for therapeutic use. Can you give some of the some examples of the more popular uses you've used in a therapeutic sense?
Certainly. Is that regarding types of boots, do you think, Jeremy? Or is that
No,
regarding...
I think it's the types of problems you encounter where you might use a therapeutic boot is how I take it.
Sure. Okay, thank you for clarifying. For me, I certainly go to therapeutic booting in the case of a laminitic horse that might be abscessing, where I'm not sure if I want to apply a prosthetic device, whether it's, you know, a shoe of metal or composite, to that foot because I want to be able to look at the foot, or maybe I don't want to nail on that foot at that moment in time. And a boot is a really good transition tool in that period because I can keep an eye on the foot, the horse is protected and supported and comfortable. And there's actually a lot of mechanics that the boot can offer to those types of horses as well, in terms of wedging or ease of breakover that we might do in a shoe that we can do with a boot as well, and it can buy you some time in the acute situation depending on what's going on. Also, boots are helpful for a horse where, say you have a horse that the owner wants to transition a horse out of shoes for some reason, that the boots can be a transitionary tool until that foot toughens up, and then you can take them out of the boots and wean them off the boots. So therapeutically, I see boots having a number of uses, but predominantly through laminitic situations or transitionary situations.
Okay. Do you have any experience using boots with mules? And do you have any recommendation for any boots that are narrow enough to fit a mule?
Yeah, you know, the hoof boots that are available out there are typically designed for horses' feet as opposed to a narrow mule foot or a donkey foot. But really, I think it's about modifying your boot selection to accommodate the different style of foot. And depending on your trim style, that might lead you to a different direction for boot, especially if you're looking at performance or therapeutic use. Jeremy, did they specify performance versus therapeutic?
No, but Terrence, if you want to type that in quickly, just let me know and we'll ask that. You talked a little bit about owners and the biggest mistake with them to avoid is setting them up for failure. Nonetheless, as strong of an educator as you may be, are there common mistakes you'll find owners make even after you help them out?
Well, yeah, owners are owners, and different owners are more compliant with our requests than others. So you can certainly make a good number of recommendations, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they'll follow them. So you need to take the temperature of your owner. If you get that sinking feeling in the pit of your stomach where you have an owner that's all gung-ho about booting, but yet you feel that compliance may be an issue, then do your best to set them up for success in terms of where you think their biggest challenge is going to be, whether that's with the specific application style or whether that's with the job they think that their horse's foot can do with the boot that you're recommending. All of those things need to be taken into account.
How long do you typically find, and I guess the answer to most things in Farrier, it would be the one here, the answer would be it depends, but considering performance hoof boots, what do you have an estimate or can give any guidance to their lifetime?
It really does depend. And the variables that seem to impact the lifetime of a boot are about the footing that the horse is working on and the job that the horse is doing. I certainly had horses that have taken a therapeutic boot and destroyed it in a matter of a couple of days. That's not typical, but that has happened to me. And I've also had performance horses that wear the same boots on aggressive terrain for 5 and 6 years. So really, each end of the spectrum is possible. I would say on average, most boots, if they're fit well and they suit the horse's job, will last a good number of years before you need to consider replacing the boots just due to wear and tear.
Okay. Follow up to the mule question, they're going to be used for riding trails and rocky terrain.
Okay, so that can be a little challenging. The boots that you could go to for mules are going to be a little limited in their selection process because of the difference in the foot shape. And some mules have a more horse foot shape, and some mules have a more donkey foot shape, so to speak. So really, it's going to be individual as to what your trim style is. For example, my trim style is a fairly short toe. So I find that I can fit mules even in boots that most horses would fit in because of the thickness of the wall and the roll that I apply to the toe. If you're finding that that might be otherwise, or you're concerned that might be otherwise, I would think about the design of the mule foot in general being thick wall and compact and fairly hardy. And is there something that you could look at in your trim style that could facilitate the owner being successful with their boots? Because I don't tend to have a problem with a lot of boot fits on mule feet. Although you certainly can have unusual mule feet, they're certainly much more donkey-like as well.
Okay. Daisy, how much of your business is related to booting?
That's a really good question. We use boots therapeutically a lot. And we also use boots performance-wise a good bit, but less common because I tend to go to a glue-on composite shoe for my performance horses. So I typically use boots as a transition tool for a horse that's, say, coming out of either a composite or a metal shoe, and once the owner wants to go barefoot, or we decide as a team that the horse should go barefoot. Or therapeutically, the horse might be in boots. But I feel that any horse that's in boots full time, meaning 24/7, needs their boots on for more than 4 to 6 weeks should honestly, in my opinion, be in a shoe. So I don't like to leave my therapeutic cases even in boots long term. I'd prefer to put them in shoes of some kind, unless it's a cost concern or there's another reason that's outstanding. So in my clientele, the horses I have in boots, probably half to a quarter, somewhere in there, depending on whether you're talking therapeutic or performance. I know that's a big range, but there's a lot of different instances that we use hoof boots, and it might actually be more than that. It might be closer to really half or more, because there's a lot of different applications. Some horses go in boots seasonally, and then they're in shoes seasonally, or some horses we use boots transitionally and then they go to something else, or some horses we're relying on them more because they're in a rehabilitative place where they just need the boot.
Okay. Do you need any sort of licensing to sell boots?
Nope, not at all. A lot of the manufacturers have different agreements with their distributors or their dealers, and so each manufacturer has a different setup for that. But in terms of licensure, no, not at all.
Okay.
At least not in the U.S. If that's different in another country, I'm not necessarily an expert on that, but here in the U.S. I can say no, you don't.
Okay. How do you use hoof pads in boots, and if so, if you do, can you talk a little bit about how you use them with different boot styles?
Yeah, that gets back to the idea for me that a therapeutic boot is a therapeutic boot and a performance boot is a performance boot. And I've seen performance boots used therapeutically, and it doesn't suit my philosophy because in my mind, we spend so much time on our trim that to use a boot that's designed to fit a horse very tightly in a performance sense for therapy, there are better boots to me for therapeutic purpose. And I'm thinking a lot about my leverages and my mechanics. When I'm dealing with a therapeutic horse, I don't say want to increase my breakover on a laminitic horse or necessarily make my whole footprint bigger on a arthritic horse. So I like to use the boot that's appropriate for the situation, that fits the foot the most compact, unless I'm looking for, honestly, a bedroom slipper. So some of the boots are really designed for bedroom slippers, like the Soft Ride and the Cloud, and some of the boots are really designed for performance and going forward with a foot that's fairly healthy. So padding can be quite complicated in that the therapeutic boots often come with their own pad. So the Soft Ride boot comes with a gel pad that has additional frog support that's on a wedge. The Cloud boot comes with a foam pad that conforms with the horse's foot a little bit differently and does not have a specific frog support, although because it conforms with the horse's foot, it will give frog support as well. And those boots therapeutically are designed to provide support and comfort and cushioning and be generous in their fit. Where a performance boot, if you have a horse that has a thin sole and needs protection, especially here in the Northeast USA where we have a lot of moisture, we deal with horses that maybe seasonally might get a little thin-soled and a little foot sore because they're thin-soled, but otherwise do a really good job of staying barefoot and sound. We might offer the owner a boot that has a thin pad. There's all sorts of materials available in those cases. You can look at gel pour-ins for boots. You can look at neoprene, or even a washcloth at times could be an appropriate pad for a horse's boot. If you're looking performance-wise and you need padding, there are thinner pads that are available because the boot has to fit tighter. And depending on the situation, that's something that you might want to consider a shoe for if you need a lot of padding with a boot in order to keep that horse sound in its job. So again, wide variety of options depending on performance versus therapy, and materials vary a good bit. And so I'd encourage you, if you're not sure what direction you want to look, to really talk to the manufacturers about what they find practitioners are most successful with, or certainly I'm glad to answer additional specific questions as well, or other practitioners that use boots. We all have slightly different materials that we may gravitate towards, but it doesn't negate the benefit of other materials as well. There's a lot of options.
Okay, do you find, not in therapeutics, but maybe just for performance boots, do you ever find that you usually will add more cushion to what the boot comes with from the manufacturer?
Not typically. Most of my horses that go into a performance boot are going to have a pretty solid bare hoof that, depending on their job, just requires a little bit more protection or support or mechanics or what have you to do their job. But their foot, to me, should be pretty solid before you go and ride your horse and work your horse with something like a boot and leave them barefoot the rest of the time. So I don't typically have to go to padding in general. If I have a horse that's not going to be sound in a boot without significant padding, I'm personally going to go to a composite shoe in my practice. You might have other tools available to you, and you might find that you can offer that horse more support or more padding in a boot, and that suits that horse. That's just the choice that I make.
Okay. For therapeutic booting, where boots need to stay on for 24/7, how do you deal with the accumulated moisture within the boots?
That's a really good question. I personally like to go to Gold Bond powder or some kind of powder that has an antimicrobial in it, whether it's a generic Gold Bond or something like that. But I would not recommend a horse stay in a boot in my high humidity, high moisture environment without something like Gold Bond or something in the boot as well. Although if you're in a dry environment, you might find that that's not necessary. But certainly, if you have a therapeutic case, you put it in the boot and it's humid and it traps in a lot of moisture, the last thing you want to do is grow bacteria inside that boot or create a high heat or high moisture environment. And I find that Gold Bond is really helpful in preventing that.
Okay, a couple business-oriented questions. What success, or is it worth contacting boot companies for getting some sample pairs? And piggyback on that, is it simple to return boots that maybe just don't work or maybe just don't fit that well?
Well, I think that that's part of the learning curve and respecting that the manufacturer knows the fit of their boot and what the boot is intended for. So if you're looking to get some samples, or if you're looking to get assistance with your learning curve in applying boots, you order a pair and you find out they don't fit as well as you need, the manufacturers typically also sell direct to the horse owner. And they're used to going through the same interview process that you might go through in trying to help your horse owner select the right boot that's the right size that will do the job for the horse that they're comfortable applying. So in that case, before you order a boot, or if you're interested in some samples, I would contact the manufacturer directly and recommend that you talk to them about what you're looking to do and see how they want to help you. Because you'd be surprised, they can send you a fit kit potentially, or if you have a specific horse in mind, sometimes it's helpful to talk to the owner and say, look, I'll donate my time for helping you through this process if you pay for the boots, and that will help me gain experience and learn and go through the process without having to charge you extra money for my learning curve. So there's some things you can do to be creative to help set you up for success and gain that experience. But the manufacturers are really there to facilitate your success.
Could you maybe review like a smart process you have for buying and managing the inventory for selling boots, and explain how you turn a profit with that?
Sure. For me, my business model is based on A, making a certain amount of money per day, and B, knowing what my time is worth plus the cost of my materials. And that, I think, is a pretty standard business model for most farriers that work full-time, doing a variety of services for their clients. We have to account for the overhead and the cost of our materials, And we need to value our time based on what kind of work and how much work are we doing each day, and what's our year-end goal, and what kind of profit do we want to make, and all of those various and sundry things. So for me in boot fitting, I have an hourly rate that I already charge clients if I'm doing consultation, or if it's an initial visit to the horse where we're going to be doing a lot more talking and less actually working on the horse. So if I break down my hourly rate, it doesn't matter to me what I'm doing if I'm not spending my own money on the cost of materials. I can trim a horse at that hourly rate. I can do a boot consultation at that hourly rate. I can review the horse's management situation, say in a therapeutic case of a metabolic horse. If the vet and I and the owner all need to be on the same page, I'm still being compensated for my time, so I can justify taking the time in my business to do those sorts of things. Then it's just a matter of working in the cost of your time to order inventory and manage your inventory in terms of keeping it organized and neat and reviewing it so you have the right boots on hand at any time. And also the overhead that you have to necessarily put money out of pocket up front to carry that inventory. So it might be something that initially you start slowly with, and then over time you build up your inventory as that's something that is a valuable service your clients may ask you to do when you are proficient. There are things that the manufacturers do that can also help you with that, like a fit kit, where maybe you don't have to carry the inventory right up front, but you have one basic boot of a certain type in each size. And that way, when you make a recommendation, you can take the fit kit, you can put it on the horse, and become a lot more accurate in your recommendation. Also, for example, I order routinely from Easy Care because they offer a program called Fill Your Truck, which is basically a way for a hoof care provider or a vet to start carrying boots or add to their existing boot inventory and place an order up to a certain amount of money where they can, you can make payments on a 6-month basis with no interest, which is very generous. So that really, for me, facilitates my ability to carry an inventory yet spread out the overhead so that I know, okay, well, if my monthly payment is, say, just as an example, say $300 a month, I need to move in my inventory a certain number of boots in order to justify having the inventory and justify having that payment in addition to the time it takes. So for me, it was simple to break it down into a business model and then look at what tools were available to facilitate carrying that inventory and helping my cash flow. Because I think that's one of the biggest hurdles we run into is, yeah, you can spend, say, $3,000 on inventory, but you may not sell that for 2 years. And in the meantime, that inventory sits in your truck or sits in your house and new boots come out, or you don't sell the tiniest size. And those are all things that we have to consider. So that Fill Your Truck program helps make it easier for me to get an inventory of boots that I know I have selection to offer my clients, and yet I don't have to bear the burden of that overhead all at once.
Okay. How do you handle that client that wants a good boot fit, but also wants a lengthy trim cycle?
Well, those two things are probably, in my mind, quite incompatible depending on your environment. You know, if you live in a dry, arid environment and the horse wears its feet on the footing, then maybe doing an 8 to 10 week trim cycle makes a lot of sense because the horse just doesn't distort and doesn't grow that much. But in my wet environment, our horse's feet grow a lot of unsupported wall and on a barefoot horse, and certainly distort quite quickly with the humidity and the moisture content. So I find that my horses need to be on a 4 to 6 week trim cycle, depending on the time of year and the humidity level, for me to maintain a non-distorted foot. And that's the message I would give to the owner, is say, look, I'm glad to support you in this process, but it's unrealistic in our environment to have a boot accurately fit from trim to end of cycle over an 8 to 10 week period of time, say. So personally, if I had an owner that was telling me that the trim cycle they didn't want to do shorter, then I probably would not sell them the boots. And if they want to buy boots on their own for their horse, then that's fine. but I would not want to be the one responsible for fitting, performance, success of their boot selection based on their lack of desire to maintain a non-distorted foot on a shorter interval.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about the Mueller's tape that you use?
Yeah, Mueller's tape is fantastic. It's an athletic tape that when it gets warm, it gets sticky. So under boots, it's nice sometimes, especially designed with the glove boots or those types of boots, that you can apply a couple wraps of Mueller's tape right at the bottom edge of the hoof. Some practitioners and users wrap the tape under the sole area just a little bit. Some keep it just on the last, say, inch of wall. But if you wrap that around a couple of times and then put your boot, your well-fitting, snug-fit boot on, when that foot gets warm, which is quite quickly, the tape becomes sticky, and it will help with boot retention. Say, for example, one of the hardest times to keep on boots is cantering uphill, because you've got a lot of force going on those boots, and the foot can slip out of the back of the boot if you're not really secure in your fit. Let's say a wet foot cantering uphill, you need every advantage you can get, so the tape helps with that.
Okay. Here's a couple questions about some modifications. Have you ever applied a shoe to a boot to get the mechanics you're looking for?
In a therapeutic purpose, certainly. There's a lot of different modifications you can do to the bottom of a boot in order to help. Just as an example, in a performance sense, I had a situation with a client who had a gaited horse who was tripping on the trail, and she was doing not necessarily fast speeds, but she was an avid trail rider who liked to move down the trail. And she wasn't competitive, but this was her pleasure horse, and she would get very scared when her horse would trip and fall down. And the horse had really good feet, but her environment where she trained and rode and went pleasure riding was very, very, very rocky, and she didn't want to risk the horse bruising. But in putting boots on, we had a lengthening of breakover and a widening of the circumference of the foot just by the nature of the boot. So even in any boot she had tried before, the horse tripping problem became even worse. And so I modified her trim style a little bit and then fit her with a fairly snug boot. And then I actually ground additional mechanics into the bottom of the boot with a cordless grinder, and was able to eliminate her tripping and stumbling completely, even in a boot that made the whole foot physically bigger. So performance-wise, there's things you can do with your modifications. In terms of therapeutically, there are a lot of add-ons available that you can put on the bottom of the boot, whether it's a click system from Easy Care, or SoftRide has a prosthetic you can put on the bottom of a boot, or whether you just want to add a plastic wedge, or I've seen shoes with mechanics screwed onto the bottom of a boot in order to facilitate what you're looking to accomplish with that horse, and that's all been really successful. So absolutely, I encourage you to modify or add a shoe on the bottom if you need some height or some mechanics, or look at some of the things that are available from some of the manufacturers, because you can really be quite creative.
Let's maybe just say for a general use boot for a trail rider, what's about the average cost per boot, and do you get a volume discount from manufacturers?
Good question. The average cost per boot varies greatly. There are inexpensive boots that can run you $50 a boot, so $100 to $110 to $120 a pair. Then at the same time, there are boots that are a good bit more expensive than that, and there are custom boots that can be quite a lot more expensive than that. The manufacturers want to motivate you to help the owner with their booting process, and so different manufacturers have different discount programs, and certainly it's volume related. So for me, I have made the decision that I'm going to match the best price that my owner can get for their boot. So for example, with the Easy Care boots, a lot of times I'm competing with something like Valley Vet in terms of pricing for the boot itself. I don't mind that because really the difference in the MSRP versus what Valley Vet can offer, say, because they buy in a very large quantity and they have free shipping or something like that, the value is not in the lowest cost of the boot. The value for the owner buying the boot from me is that I am there to support them in the fitting and the application process, and they have a person standing behind the success of the boot. And so I don't need to be competitive with the price of the boot because I'm charging for my time. I can actually charge appropriately for those added benefits without having to compete. But certainly the more volume you buy, the more the manufacturer is going to give you a quantity discount, and different manufacturers have different programs. So you'd have to ask them specifically for details of each program itself. But I tend to not worry about that too much because it's really not where I make my money.
Okay. What do you think of the stud kits available for boots?
I actually use them a lot. Here in the Northeast, we have a lot of mud and a lot of tall, wet grass, and I can also use them to help facilitate mechanics with certain horses. If I have a low-heeled horse, I can add, like say, some of the quick studs, or if I have a horse that wants to jump, there are some studs that you can add and remove to boots, just like you would to a shoe. So for me, I tend to use quick studs when the owner asks for them. If they have a traction issue, I will offer them the quick studs, of course, because I want them to be confident in the traction that the boot is going to offer them. I personally own a horse who tends to be a little bit frenetic with his foot placement, and we've had some slipping. And so I use studs on him, yet I've ridden other horses, and I've had other clients that have said, I don't need those studs because my horse is sure-footed, and then I respect their desire. So it's certainly something that we use a fair bit, especially seasonally if there's mud or tall, wet grass, but not every horse and not every situation and not every boot.
Here's an interesting thing. This is the first time our Q&A has gone longer than the actual presentation. So we could be here for a few more hours with the number of questions, but we'll just go through a couple more.
Great.
What boots do you recommend for a very large-footed draft horse who may be transitioning from shoes? And the note here is their feet tend to be much wider at the beginning.
Yeah, to me, that's a therapeutic purpose. Riding boots for draft horses can be a little challenging, although there are certainly boots that come in larger sizes. And I would just suggest that you check the various size charts for the different boots that are out there. But one boot in particular that recently has impressed me with its ability to be large size and help some of the draft horses with transition or sore foot issues is the Easy Boot Cloud. That boot in particular comes in a fairly large size and is fairly draft foot shaped in its nature and can be modified quite easily with a little bit of extra padding if you really feel like you've got extra room in the toe. I personally have a draft cross right now with fairly large feet who is using them and doing really, really well in them, and I was very impressed with the fit and the application. Some of the other boots, if they come in larger sizes, they're not necessarily geared for that draft foot that's wider than it is long and are more warm blood shaped or longer toe shaped and really slosh around on the draft horses. So I appreciate the dilemma, but I would direct you in my personal experience towards the Cloud for that situation.
Okay, and for our last question, this will cover quite a few questions we have here from people. But do you use hind boots as much as you use front boots? And what are some of the thoughts you have on hind boots?
Jeremy, do you think that question is directed towards therapeutic or performance application?
Let's talk about both separately.
Okay, fair enough. So starting with therapeutic application, certainly I think most of the times the horses I see, their feet are taking more detriment in the front than they are in the back. So unless I have a specific problem in the back, I really boot my therapeutic cases predominantly in the front. Although if you have a horse that's foundered in all 4 feet, you should certainly boot all 4 feet. And depending on the footing they're standing on, sometimes those therapeutic cases, if they're standing in a deeply bedded stall and the front feet are really worse than the hinds, you might only need to boot the fronts and not the hinds. Whereas if they're standing on concrete out in a paddock or really hard dirt footing, you might want to therapeutically boot all 4 feet. So sometimes it's a matter of really looking at what you need cushioning for and what you need protection for. And really that tends to blend over into performance as well, because horses that have issues with their front feet, sometimes the hind feet aren't as bad. So if you're being proactive and saying, I know this horse is transitioning in environments, or the foot is in a transition place, and we just need some temporary protection, then it might be okay to just offer protection to those front feet if the hind feet are pretty good or the footing is decent. But if you're being proactive and worried about the horse either bruising, or you're worried about the horse working at speed, say you have an endurance horse, then it's probably important to consider the terrain they're working on and whether you're just working to prevent bruising or prevent trauma and protect those feet as necessary. But typically, we're most commonly only booting front feet unless we're dealing with a train wreck therapeutic case, like a horse that's foundering on all 4 feet and lives on a hard ground, or conversely, a high-end performance situation where you've got a horse that's flying down the trail on rocks, on variable terrain, in and out of water, and you just want to prevent those feet from taking any damage. Then you might boot all 4 feet. So it's kind of the opposite ends of the spectrum, and the horses in the middle, I find typically most commonly only need front.